went to my chair to wake up and did not wake up, went back to sleep. One of those mornings. All right, we are in Judges chapter 5. So we've been looking at Deborah and Barak. We finished up chapter 4 last week, and we just kind of got started on chapter 5 a little bit. And so chapter 5 is a song of Barak and Deborah, really a song of Deborah. And it's going to give us, as we talked about, it's really just an overview of what we have seen already in the last chapter. But we do get some more details as we go through it. So as we go through this chapter, I don't plan on, we'll probably spend today, but I don't think we're going to spend more than just today to get through this chapter. There's several verses, but somebody want to read verse 1 through, let's say verse 9. Nobody wants to.
Deborah and Barak, the son of Abinoam, on that day, saying, Praise ye the Lord for the avenging of Israel, when the people willingly offered themselves. Hear, O ye kings, give ear, O ye princes. Even I will sing unto the Lord. I will sing praise to the Lord God of Israel. Lord, when thou wentest out of Seir, when thou marchest out of the field of Edom, the earth trembled, and the heavens dropped, the clouds also dropped water. The mountains melted from before the Lord, even that Sinai from before the Lord God of Israel. In the days of Shamgar, the son of Anath, on the days of Jael, the highways were unoccupied, and the travelers walked through byways. The inhabitants of the villages ceased in Israel until that I, Deborah, arose, as a mother in Israel. They chose new gods, then was war in the gates. Was there a shield or spear seen among 40,000 in Israel? My heart is toward the governors of Israel that offer themselves willingly among the people. Bless ye the Lord.
All right, so we talked about chapter 4 was one battle. Okay, so it was just one of several battles. The first battle really that took out Sisera and his army, which is the main army of Jabin. And so this chapter is really going to be after they've defeated and had rest, the Canaanites. So when we look at chapter 5, it's going to be also talking about some of the later battles that they had. And we talked about there was only two nations or two tribes in chapter 4 that were called to fight against Jabin. So they had 10,000 men from those two tribes. Well, we find out there's more tribes in chapter 5 that also fought along later. And so verse 1, we see that this is a song of victory. So verse 2, it says, when leaders in Israel and the people willingly offer themselves, bless the Lord. Did they willingly offer themselves in the beginning? What did it take to stop this oppression in the beginning? It took Deborah, right? It took Deborah to stand up because nobody else was. And so when we see this, the leaders led them into victory. The leaders in Israel, when the people willingly offer themselves, we see that the leaders are doing something and the people are doing something that's really focused upon after they've had that first battle with Barak. And so she is looking at the battles that have happened afterwards, and she is saying it's a victory that the leaders have stood up and led like they needed to. It is amazing how the people have willingly offered themselves to fight. She was a leader, right? So was Barak. You have other leaders. You have the people. But what does she say? Bless the Lord. What does that mean? He was the leader, right? God was the one that brought the victory. She gave him the credit. She gave God the glory for all that had happened. And so God, of course, as we talked about with all of these previous, Shamgar, with Othniel, with Ehud, with all of the different judges before, who went before them to defeat the enemy? God did. So she knows that, and she stated that in chapter 4. She told when she was talking to Barak, trying to get him to encourage him to stand up and fight. She mentioned the fact that God had already gone before them. And so, yeah, they went and did the battle. They went and fought the battle, but God was the one that determined the outcome. And so they were the vessel of doing the will of God, okay? And so that's, kind of what we are today, aren't we? Are we the vessel that does the will of God for him? God could do it without us, couldn't he? But he chose to put us into the work. And so you think about the New Testament also. When we think about the gospel going out, God could cause the gospel to just appear in people's heads, right? He has the ability to do anything, but he sends his messengers. And so they had to do their part. And so she is thankful that the people stood up and fought, did what God wanted, finally, after serving the Baals and all that for years. But she gives God the glory. So then verse 3, it says, "Hear, O kings, give ear, O princes. Even I will sing to the Lord. I will sing praise to the Lord God of Israel." Again, she is seeing that power of God, and she is in blessing and giving him the praise. Verse 4, "Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the field of Edom, the earth trembled, the heavens poured, the clouds opened, also poured water." And so she went out, he says it went out from Seir. Well, Seir is Edom, okay? And so the Edomites, they were descendants of Esau. And so you see that the language used here, we see this with the book of Revelation, right? The earth trembled, the heavens poured, the clouds also poured water. What does that mean? Okay, it shows his power, right? This is poetic, but when we look at that same type of language in the book of Revelation, apocalyptic language, it's focused upon his power. And so God coming out of Mount Seir means he had went before, his power went before to destroy Edom. I mean, they had no choice. As we talked about several times, this is the reoccurring theme as we go through this book. It did not matter. God is in control. God raises up nations. God brings down nations. And so Edom, God determined their time was done, and it was over. And so when God decided that Israel needed to be done and go into captivity, it happened. And so we see that again here. God's power against Edom. And so then verse 5, "The mountains gush before the Lord, this Sinai before the Lord God of Israel." Verse 6, "In the days of Shamgar, son of Anath, in the days of Jael, the highways were deserted, and the travelers walked along the byways." And so what do we see with verse 6? Verse 5 kind of goes along with verse 4, but verse 6, "In the days of Shamgar," that was one of the judges, right? And so a lot of people don't want to attribute Shamgar as a judge because there's only one verse dedicated to him back in chapter 3, the end of chapter 3. But she brings up Shamgar. And so she says, "Even in the days of Shamgar, the son of Anath, in the days of Jael." Why does she say Jael? She was the one that killed Sisera. She was the one that Deborah said would get the glory that day, the honor. It wasn't going to go to Barak. It wasn't going to go to his men. It was going to go to a woman, which was Jael. And so it says, "In the days of Jael, the highways were deserted, and the travelers walked along the byways." What does that mean? What does that sound like? Verse 7, "Village life ceased. It ceased in Israel." What does that sound like? People didn't want to be out, right? There was great fear in the nation because of the oppressors. It wasn't safe. And so all of that was happening until Deborah, arose a mother in Israel. And so she calls herself a mother in Israel. And so what would that include? Why would she say that?
She encouraged everyone
Yeah, she encouraged him. She protected him. She was really the backbone of the battle, wasn't it? Barak and his men went out and fought, but he wouldn't go without her, would he? And so who really was the backbone, the strength of that battle, that army? It was Deborah. She was the one that was bringing that strength. So she had great influence and strength and courage. You know, is there a lot of women in the congregation here and in any other places that are the same way, that bring about the strength, the encouragement to those that may be standing up, doing things, and giving lessons or leading songs or doing things like that? Yeah, that's an important part, isn't it? Deborah is a good example of being that strength, that encourager. The church needs encouragers, don't we? Everybody needs encouragement as we go along. And so it's an important job, and she had an important job. And so verse 8 says, then they chose new gods. Then there was war in the gates. Not a shield or spear was seen among 40,000 in Israel. My heart is with the rulers of Israel who offer themselves willingly to the people. Bless the Lord. And so they chose new gods. Now, this is really a history lesson, right? Because we're going back to the time where going back to the time of Shamgar, to her, at the beginning when things were not safe. Why was it not safe? She gives the reason here. Okay, there was war in the gates, but what caused that war in the gates? They turned their hearts away from God. There was fear in Israel because they turned their backs on God. We talk about Israel being the promised land, right? God promised them that they would have safety, plentiful food, everything that they would need as long as they followed him. And when they didn't follow him, all of that disappeared. And so we see that here with this example. She is saying the reason there was no safety, the reason you were in fear was because you chose other gods. You went and chased after other people, and so, or other nations. And so she is saying there was war in the gates, but not a shield or spear was seen among 40,000 Israel. Now, it's interesting because what tools did they use to fight? With Shamgar, with Barak. Yeah, they turned the equipment that they used to farm with, to do their normal daily lives, right? You took those weapons and they fought. Because we talked about the people up in this area, because remember this oppression with Deborah. So Shamgar was down here, so he was fighting against the Canaanites, and it talked about his ox goad. So he was a farmer. This is a very fertile area. Up here in Galilee, this is where Deborah's oppression was. There was the trees, and they were oppressed and were caused to cut trees down. So they used the axe and things like that. And so there was no weapons in Israel at that time. Knox says this: they did not have many weapons available to them because of their rebellion to God and because of the oppression which they endured. One of the things an occupying army will do to eliminate as many weapons as they can from a conquered people. These were dire times for the Israelites. And so when they were oppressed, they went in and took their weapons. They took everything they would use to fight against them. Now, they didn't expect them to turn their tools of trade into weapons, but that's what they did, okay? And so that's what we see here. There was fear. And so verse 9, my heart is with the rulers of Israel who offer themselves willingly with the people. Bless the Lord. And so again, she's given that glory to God. All right, verse 10. Somebody want to read verse 10 through 18, please.
Speak you who ride on white donkeys, who sit in judges' attire, and who walk along the road. Far from the noise of the archers among the watering places, there they shall recount the righteous acts of the Lord, the righteous acts for his villagers in Israel. Then the people of the Lord shall go down to the gates. Awake, awake, Deborah, awake, awake, sing a song. Arise, Barak, and lead your captives away, O son of Abinoam. Then the survivors came down, the people against the nobles. The Lord came down for me against the mighty. From Ephraim, where there were those whose roots were in Amalek. After you, Benjamin, with your peoples. From Machir, rulers came down. And from Zebulun, those who bear the recruiter's staff. And the princes of Issachar were with Deborah, as Issachar so was Barak, sent into the valley under his command. Among the divisions of Reuben, there were great resolves of heart. Why did you sit among the sheepfolds to hear the pipings for the flocks? The divisions of Reuben have great searchings of heart. Gilead stayed beyond the Jordan, and why did Dan remain on ships? Asher continued at the seashore and stayed by his inlets. Zebulun is a people who jeopardize their lives to the point of death. Naphtali also on the heights of the battlefield.
All right, so going back to verse 10, it says, "Speak you who ride on white donkeys." Donkeys. And think about what did Christ ride upon into Jerusalem? A donkey, right? A foal, huh? I'm not sure if it was white. I'm not sure of that detail. But we do know it was a donkey. And so when you think about donkeys, nobility is kind of what is being referred to here. She has mentioned the leaders, the rulers of this time, but she says, "Speak you who ride on white donkeys, who sit in judges' attire, and who walk along the road." Those she's referring to is those that judge, those that were rulers, those that sat in the gates of the city, those that really were nobility. So kings' sons would ride on a donkey, and so did Christ. We think about the significance of that. Christ didn't come into Jerusalem on a horse, which would have meant that he would come with the idea of fighting as an army. He came in on a donkey, which is a reference to that peace. And so she's referring to those people, those that are leaders, those that were the nobility at that time, riding in on those white donkeys. In verse 11, "Far from the noise of the archers among the watering places, there they shall recount the righteous acts of the Lord. The righteous acts were his villagers in Israel, and the people of the Lord shall go down to the gates." And so it says they were trying, we're talking about the safety again. They would try to get waters out of the wells, but what were the archers doing? They were keeping them from doing that, being able to do that. And so you go down to verse 12, it says, "Awake, awake, Deborah, awake, awake, sing a song. Arise, Barak, and lead your captives away." So she's going into that battle. And so verse 13, "Then the survivors came down, the people against the nobles. The Lord came down for me against the mighty. From Ephraim were those whose roots were in Amalek. After you, Benjamin, with your peoples." And so these people that were their oppressors now became what? The oppressed. Those that were the oppressors now became the oppressed. And so in verse 14, Ephraim and Benjamin, they were fighting. From Makari, rulers came down, and Zebulun, they fought. Princes of Issachar were with Deborah. Issachar was with Barak. They went into the valley under the command among the divisions of Reuben. There were great resolves of heart. And so we're seeing those that have joined into the fight to stop these oppressors. Verse 16, "Why did you sit among the sheepfold to hear the piping for the flocks? The divisions of Reuben have great searchings of heart. Gilead stayed beyond the Jordan, while Dan remained on ships. Asher continued on the seashore and stayed by his inlets." What is that referring to? What is he saying? What is she saying about Dan, Reuben, or Dan, Gilead, and Asher? They stayed where it was safe. They went elsewhere. They were chickens. They did not fight. So Dan, Asher, and Gilead, they're farther south. And so there was a rebuke here for Gilead, Dan, and Asher because they didn't go. The Reubenites stayed with their flocks of sheep. The Gideonites were made safe beyond the Jordan. The Danites, stayed in their ships. And then we see the Asherites stayed beside the sea. And so they're being rebuked for that by Deborah. But notice Zebulun and Naphtali. Zebulun in verse 18 is a people who jeopardized their lives to the point of death. Naphtali also at the heights of the battlefield. And so those two nations did a lot to end this oppression. Now, there's two nations that are not mentioned here, which I think is interesting. Judah and Simeon. Why do you think that's the case? Where's Judah at? Well, it's down here, of course, which is, it's not really the right map. But Judah is down in this area, and Simeon. Who did she mention earlier? Shamgar, right? So, we talk about some of these judges overlap, right? Some of these judges are not, it's not one after another. Sometimes some were fighting in some area and some were fighting in another area. And so the oppression wasn't cut completely over Israel. So it's interesting, she mentioned Shamgar and Jael, right? So it could have been around the same time. We talked about that in chapter 4. So Judah, really, is that area where Shamgar was at. So the reason she may not have mentioned Judah and Simeon, because what was Judah? What was always talked about with Judah? That's where the kings would come from, right? They were also mentioned as a nation of fighters. And so it's kind of odd that they would not be part of this fight unless they're already fighting with Shamgar. And so that kind of points to, we're not told exactly when this all happened, but she brings up Shamgar and Jael at the same time as a time of no peace. So it could be that in the north you have the fighting with Naphtali and Zebulun fighting north, and then you have Judah with Shamgar during the same time fighting, and the Philistines fighting that area there we talked about in chapter 3. And so we're going to have that overlap of those two judges, it seems like, here. All right, so verse 19. So we want to read really 19 through the end of the chapter. Kind of a longer reading. Any questions before we go on? All right, I told you we weren't going to, not a lot to talk about with this chapter, but just overview. 19 through 31, please. Okay, that's fine. You can't do just half. I'm joking.
The kings came and fought. Then the kings of Canaan fought in Tanakh by the waters of Megiddo. They took no spoils of silver. They fought from the heavens. The stars from their courses fought against Sisera. The torrent of Kishon swept them away. The ancient torrent, the torrent of Kishon. O my soul, march on in strength. Then the horses' hooves pounded, the galloping of his steeds. Cursed Meroz, said the angel of the Lord. Cursed its inhabitants bitterly, because they did not come to help the Lord, to help the mighty, to help the Lord against the mighty. Most blessed among women is Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Blessed is she among the women in tents.
He asked for water, she gave milk. She brought out cream in a glory bowl. She stretched her hand to the tent peg, her right hand to the workman's hammer. She pounded Sisera, she pierced his head. She split and struck through his temple. At her feet he sank, he fell, he lay still. At her feet he sank, he fell. Where he sank, there he fell, dead. The mother of Sisera looked through the window and cried out through the lattice. Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why tarries the clatter of his chariots? Her wisest ladies answered her, yet she answered herself. Are they not finding and dividing the spoil to every man a belt or two? For Sisera plunder of dyed garments, embroidered and dyed. 2 pieces of dyed embroidery for the neck of the looter. Thus let all your enemies perish, O Lord, but let those who love you be like the sun when it comes out in full strength, so the land has rest for 40 years.
All right, so the kings came and fought. The kings of Canaan fought in Tanakh by the waters of Megiddo. They took no spoil of silver. And so these kings that come to fight. The kings are the lesser kings. And Jabin is the main king we talk about. But they come down to Megiddo to fight. And so remember we talked about this battle, this first battle, is happening in the Kishon River basin area along Megiddo. Now, if you remember back last week or the week before, Kaufman had this thought, the commentator, that because Kishon was a wadi, what is a wadi? Remember what a wadi is? Yeah, it floods or dries up. So at times it can be dry and then it can flash flood very quickly. Because the Kishon was a wadi, that God used that to cause the chariots to be defeated. So that was God's way of using a natural thing to do that. So, of course, they come down into this wadi, which is dry. They go to fight. God sends a flood, and it causes the chariots to be stuck. We talked about how Sisera got out of his chariot and ran. So it could have been the fact that he was stuck. And so look at verse 20. It says, they fought from the heavens, the stars from the courses fought against Sisera. The torrents of Kishon swept them away. So there you go. She uses a detail we don't have in the last chapter here. She says the torrents of Kishon swept them away. That could have been a reference to that happening, where there was a flood of water that stopped their chariots because of being in that dry basin. The ancient torrent, the torrent of Kishon, O my soul, march on in strength. And so she could be referring to that power that God used, which if you go back to what we looked at, I just thought about this. In verse 4, she said, the earth trembled, the heavens poured, the clouds also poured water, the mountains gushed before the Lord. You know, that is a reference in apocalyptic language to God's power, but she could be also poetically using that something that they saw happen. God sent that heavy rains from the mountains and caused the wadi to then be flooded. I think that's interesting. I just thought about that, the connection there. All right, so, but we see that in detail brought up in verse 21. And so these kings fought, but it says here they took no spoils of silver. What does that mean? Oh, go ahead.
Do we know what time of year this was?
I do not know.
Because that phrase to me, mountains melting, could mean like maybe there was a heavy snow, and then he sent that rain, and then that has even more water.
Mm-hmm. Well, and a lot of times these wadis, they were fed by mountainous runoff, and so it could have been from snow melt. The Jordan River is fed by snow melt, but it's not a wadi, of course. But yeah, it's fed by mountains also. But what is that phrase? They took no spoils of silver. What would that mean? Usually, when you go to battle, and you destroy or take over an area, what would you take? You take everything. Well, if they're not taking any spoils of silver, what does that mean? They didn't take it. They didn't win, right? They weren't victorious. And so God was with them, of course, here. And so verse 22, it says, then the horses' hoofs pounded, they galloping of his steeds. Curse Meroz, says the angel of the Lord, curse is its inhabitants bitterly, because they did not come to the help of the Lord, against the mighty. And so the curse here, the angel of the Lord curses this city. Now this city, as we're told here, the people did not come to fight and help Israel. They were under oppression, but they didn't come to fight the battle, so they wanted to reap the rewards of Israel fighting for them to bring that safety, but they didn't want to fight. And so there is a curse that's been put upon them. It says from the angel of the Lord. Now, this city, we're not really sure where it's at. Many believe that it is about 12 miles from Samaria. And so it's in this area of Megiddo, because Samaria is down in this area. So it would have been in this area. So the fighting's happening in their at their doorstep, and they're not helping at all. And so the angel of the Lord cursed them and its inhabitants bitterly. What does that mean when he says curse upon the city? I don't know. Could be that that city is going to end, its inhabitants will die. Not sure what it means when it says curse there. But we see those in other places. So in verse 24, it says, most blessed among women is Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Blessed is she among women in tents. He asked for water, she gave milk. She brought out cream in a lordly bowl. She stretched her hand in the tent peg. And so we talked about this extra detail. He asked for water, she gave him milk. But then we're also told that she gave him cream. Now, New King James says cream. The ESV, I think, said butter. The King James, what did it say? Butter. Okay. So we don't. It's something heavy to cause him to feel full and to fall asleep, right? Yeah, she put him in a food coma. Something to make him feel good. And so we all know how that feels. After a big meal, you get tired. And so she's causing him, he wanted just water. She's like, I'm going to make you go to sleep. And so verse 26, she stretched out her hand to the tent peg, in the right hand the workman's hammer. She pounded Sisera. She pierced his head. She split and struck through his temple. Now some versions say, King James says, struck off his head. We talked about that detail a little bit, but it's that splitting open his head, because that tent peg, they're metal and they're big. And so we talk about the tools of trade, right? That each one of these people used, the ox goad, things like that. What was the tool of her trade? Well, during that time, the women put up the tents. She was very used to striking a tent peg. So she takes the thing that's close to her, tent peg and a hammer, and right through his temple. And so the New King James says that it split his head open, and it killed him, of course. And so she is saying, blessed is she, Jael, because she did what Barak was not able to do. Verse 27, at her feet he sank, he fell, he lay still. At her feet he sank, he fell. Where he sank, there he fell dead. And so a reference to her defeating and fulfilling that prophecy of Deborah. And so then verse 28, the mother of Sisera looked through the window and cried out through the lattice, why is the chariot so long in coming? Why tarries the chatter of his chariots? Her wisest ladies answer her. Yes, she answered herself. And so Sisera's mother did this really happen? It may have. Deborah's singing. She doesn't know what the other side's like. But what she's really just focusing on is she is painting a picture of Sisera's mom waiting for him to return, thinking that he's going to return because he's a powerful leader. Yet God defeated him. Jael defeated him. And so she's putting this into her song. And it says she answered herself. This is really just a focus upon she's repeating to herself over and over again what she wants to believe. So Deborah is saying, she's saying, no, he's coming back. It's going to be fine. That aspect of, she's trying to convince herself that everything's fine. So then verse 30, are they not finding and dividing the spoil, to every man a girl or two? For Sisera, a plunder of dyed garments, plunder of garments embroidered in dye, 2 pieces of dyed embroidery for the neck of the looter. Saying that the facts are showing that Sisera's gone. The facts are showing that the army was defeated. She should be able to look at the facts and say it's over, but she doesn't want to. And so then verse 31, thus let all your enemies perish, O Lord, but let those who love him be like the sun when it comes out in full strength. And so the nations of the world should fear God. She's singing this song and she's saying, look at this example of what God has done to this massive, amazing army that was feared among many because there's 600 chariots of iron. They have been defeated. So any nation that is an enemy of God, beware. And she is wishing the enemies of God will suffer that same defeat. And she's also wishing and singing here, but let those who love him be like the sun. Glory, the honor, the things that they should have with following God. And so the last detail there is the land had rest for 40 years. And so this is the end of Deborah and Barak, but we see that they had rest for 40 years. All right. One last detail. Chronologically, if you're reading the Bible chronologically, between chapter 5 and chapter 6, many believe that's where Ruth fits. So if you're reading chronologically, you would again go read the book of Ruth right now. And she would fall within that time frame. So, any questions on chapter 5? All right, thank you guys. We'll pick up here in chapter 6 next week.